He was 28 years old when he died, and by then, he had already built and lost an empire made of cocaine, teenage soldiers, and fear so total that residents say rape and robbery simply stopped happening under his rule. Not because he was merciful, because he was worse than whoever might have hurt you. The world knows him as Zé Pequeno, the cackling villain from City of God. But the real man was quieter, colder, and far more calculating than Hollywood dared to show. He didn't just terrorize a neighborhood, he conquered it, boca by boca, body by body, until an entire housing project built by the government to disappear, the poor became his private kingdom. And the man who finally destroyed him, it wasn't the police, it wasn't a rival. It was the very monster he created. This is the true story Netflix won't tell you. To understand how a housing project became a war zone, you have to go back before the guns, before the cocaine, before a single shot was fired in anger. You have to go back to a decision made in a government office, far from the mud and the gunfire that decision would eventually cause. In January of 1979, Rio de Janeiro drowned. Record rains tore through the hillside favelas, clinging to the slopes above the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. Roughly 250 people died, tens of thousands lost everything, and the state saw an opportunity, not to help, but to erase. For years, a hardline politician named Carlos Lacerda had pushed a policy with a name that sounds almost bureaucratic until you understand what it meant. Removalismo. Removalism. You don't fix poverty. You truck it somewhere else and pretend it never existed. Lacerda was gone from office by the time the floodwaters hit, but his machine kept running. His successor, Governor Negrón de Lima, used the disaster as cover, loading the newly homeless into army trucks and dumping them 30 kilometers from the city center onto a drained swamp with a name that would soon become infamous around the world. Cidade de Deus, City of God. No paved roads. No school, no clinic, no bus line, no police station within 10 kilometers. The marshland bled through the foundations of the concrete houses. This wasn't neglect. This was architecture, a government engineering the disappearance of the people it didn't want to see, and calling it housing policy. What the state failed to understand, or simply didn't care to, is that a vacuum doesn't stay empty. Strip away every institution meant to hold a community together, and something else moves in to fill that space. It doesn't ask permission. It writes its own laws, appoints its own enforcers, and collects its own taxes, in blood, if it has to. Nobody in that government office in 1966 could have imagined the empire that vacant swampland would one day become, or the name of the boy who would come to rule it. They just knew they wanted him gone. They just didn't know where he'd go. While the concrete was still settling in Cidade de Deus, something else was being built on an island off the coast of Rio, and it would shape the neighborhood's future far more than anyone realized at the time. Brazil in the mid-1960s was living under a military dictatorship, one that had seized power in 1964 and would hold it for the next 21 years. Like most authoritarian regimes, it dealt with dissent by locking it away. Communists, student radicals, Marxist guerrillas, the generals swept them up and sent them to a prison called Cândido Mendes on Ilha Grande. And then the regime made a decision that would echo for decades. Instead of isolating these political prisoners, they housed them in the same cell blocks as Rio's ordinary criminals. Armed robbers, thieves, killers. The thinking, as far as anyone can reconstruct it, was humiliation. Let the intellectuals rot next to the thugs. Strip away their dignity. It backfired catastrophically, because prison doesn't just punish, it teaches. And what the guerrillas knew, they taught. Cell structures, compartmentalized communication. The movie gave you a cackling boy with a gun and a laugh that made your skin crawl. The real man was something far more unsettling, because he was quiet. José Eduardo Barreto Conceição was born in 1957, and the neighborhood called him Dadinho, little baby. He hated it. As he grew older, as the bodies started piling up behind him, he chose his own name, Zé Pequeno, Little Joe. Friends and neighbors who lived through those years and survived to talk about it later say, the Sam's most infamous scene, the cold-blooded massacre of children, wasn't even his doing. That detail matters, because it points to something the movie flattened for drama. The real Zé Pequeno wasn't chaos. He was control. By the late 1970s, cocaine had arrived in Rio, flooding in through the Amazon and the port cities, and the economics of the drug trade flipped overnight. A kilo of marijuana might net a few $100s. A kilo of cocaine could net 10,000. And suddenly, the customers weren't just poor neighbors. They were the sons and daughters of Rio's elite, buying from the same slums their parents had voted to hide. That kind of money doesn't stay divided for long. Around 1979, when Cidade de Deus had a dozen or so independently run drug points, bocas de fumo, mouths of smoke, Zé Pequeno began doing something no one in the favela had done before. He started buying them, absorbing them, and when that didn't work, he started killing their owners. Some were ambushed, some were shot in front of their own families. Within roughly 2 years, by most surviving accounts, he controlled nearly every boca in the neighborhood. A monopoly, built the way monopolies are always built, by eliminating the competition. And here is the detail that unsettles people more than any gunfight. Residents say that under his rule, you did not get robbed. You did not get raped. If someone broke those rules and got caught, they were executed behind the church, and everyone knew why. That was the paradox at the center of Zé Pequeno's kingdom. He wasn't feared because he brought chaos. He was feared because he brought order, and everyone understood exactly what that order would cost them. Every kingdom eventually meets the one man who refuses to bow. In Cidade de Deus, that man wasn't a rival trafficker looking to steal territory. He wasn't chasing money at all. His name was Manuel Machado Rocha, born on May 12, 1952. He'd grown up on the same broken streets as everyone else in that forgotten housing grid. Petty robberies as a kid, a string of arrests, the ordinary trajectory of a favela boy with no ladder to climb. But at 18, he did something different. He joined the Brazilian army, served in an infantry battalion, and turned out to be one of the best marksmen in his unit. Then he came home. The neighborhood knew him as Mané Galinha, Knockout Ned, and for a while, he was just another face in a community, trying to survive. Then, sometime in 1979, Zé Pequeno's men crossed a line that even cocaine money couldn't paper over. They seized and assaulted Manuel's girlfriend. It wasn't a business dispute. It was a personal humiliation, aimed at a man the whole neighborhood respected. And it detonated something no drug war ever had in that neighborhood before. Manuel picked up a gun, and unlike anyone else who'd crossed Zé Pequeno, he actually knew how to use one. He struck first, killing 2 of Zé Pequeno's men in his opening raid, then turned on the soldiers, then on anyone still selling for the king. Within months, the neighborhood split in half, one army loyal to Zé Pequeno, another rallying behind Manuel, armed and expanding by the week. Caught in between were tens of thousands of residents just trying to keep their children alive, in a labyrinth of alleyways barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Make no mistake, Manuel was no saint. He carried a gun. He ran his own crew. He had blood on his hands like everyone else in that war. But he was the only man in Cidade de Deus who stood up to the king, and he didn't do it for territory or profit. He did it for a woman he loved and couldn't protect any other way. The neighborhood noticed, and the neighborhood never forgot it, because on September 30th, 1979, Zé Pequeno's men finally found where he lived. They found Manuel at his own home and gunned him down in front of his parents and his younger siblings. He was 27 years old. The neighborhood turned out for his funeral in numbers the police couldn't agree. A housing project the government had tried to erase, mourning openly for a man who dared to fight the king it had accidentally created. Zé Pequeno had won his war. What he hadn't counted on was that winning a war and holding an empire are 2 very different things. Leadership in the aftermath passed briefly to a trafficker named Ailton Bata, the real inspiration behind the movie's Sonora, a character who never actually existed as one man. The killing continued through the early 1980s, weekly, relentless, until the bodies started making the newspapers in Rio's wealthier zones, and the police finally began paying attention, not out of conscience, but embarrassment. Then, in 1985, the same year Brazil's military dictatorship finally collapsed. After 21 years in power, Zé Pequeno's own story ended. He'd been arrested, escaped from Frei Caneca prison, and made his way back to Cidade de Deus to reclaim the empire he'd built. But empires don't wait. A new generation had already taken over the bocas in his absence, and they had no intention of handing anything back. Accounts of exactly how he died still conflict. Some say a rival faction shot him. Others say his body carried no wounds at all, that it was an overdose, and his own men quietly carried his corpse out of the favela rather than let the police find it there. What everyone agrees on is the irony sitting underneath both versions. The man who conquered a neighborhood through calculated, ruthless killing wasn't taken down by the police, and he wasn't taken down by Manuel. He was erased by the very machine of young killers he had built to serve him. He was 28 years old. He'd ruled Cidade de Deus for roughly 6 years, and in that time, by the lowest credible estimates, he had killed dozens of people personally and ordered the deaths of dozens more. He died the way almost every favela kingpin since has died. Young, replaced, and already forgotten by the empire he built. What's left, in the end, isn't really a story about two men and a drug war. It's a story about a decision made in a government office in 1966. A decision to take the poorest, darkest-skinned families in Rio de Janeiro and truck them somewhere nobody would have to look at them. Everything that followed, the monopoly, the massacre, the funeral that stopped a neighborhood, grew out of that single act of erasure. There was a boy watching all of it happen. His name was Paulo Lins, and unlike almost everyone else in this story, he lived. He grew up playing soccer in the same alleys where his friends would later die in them. And when he became a researcher, walking those streets with a notebook, interviewing killers and mothers of killers and priests who buried them both, he understood something the rest of the world didn't want to face. If he didn't write it down, the names would simply vanish. The architecture that killed them would get rebuilt somewhere else, on some other forgotten swamp, by people who never learned what had already failed here once. Zé Pequeno left no fortune, no children who carry his name in public, and a body count no historian has ever fully calculated. Manuel left a fiancé he couldn't protect, a legend the favela never let die, and a moral question that still doesn't have a clean answer. What do you call a man who does something monstrous for a reason that isn't monstrous at all? Cidade de Deus is still there, still contested. The rifles the kids carry today are heavier than the ones their grandfathers used. The war never really ended. It just changed which names get remembered. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because next week we go inside another empire the world only thinks it understands.